A caseworker at my door showed me adoption papers and said, "You're not their biological child. Your real parents have been searching for you for 30 years." I stood in my doorway holding my 2-year-old son on my hip, staring at the woman who'd just shattered my understanding of my own existence. She was in her 50s with graying hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wearing a county employee badge that identified her as Leslie Ortega, Family Services Division. The manila folder in her hands looked worn, like it had been opened and closed countless times over the years. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd delivered terrible news before. "I know this is shocking, but I need to speak with you about your adoption, specifically about irregularities in the paperwork filed when you were 3 years old. Your biological parents, Richard and Susan Novak, have been searching for you since 1995. They never consented to your adoption. According to our investigation, you were taken from them under false pretenses." My son squirmed in my arms, and I set him down automatically, my hands shaking. Behind me, my wife Amanda appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. "David, what's going on?" she asked. I couldn't answer because my brain was stuck on one impossible statement. I wasn't their biological child. The people I'd called Mom and Dad my entire life, Gerald and Diane Thompson, had adopted me. Except I'd never known I was adopted. Every document I'd ever seen said they were my birth parents. My birth certificate listed Diane as my mother and Gerald as my father. I had baby photos in their house, had grown up hearing stories about my difficult birth and my early years. How could any of that be fake? "There must be a mistake," I said, finding my voice. "I'm not adopted. I have a birth certificate. I've seen it. My parents are Gerald and Diane Thompson. They've never said anything about adoption." Leslie Ortega's expression was a mixture of sympathy and something harder, more determined. "Mr. Thompson, I understand this is overwhelming, but the birth certificate you've seen was falsified. Your biological parents are Richard and Susan Novak from Oregon. In 1995, when you were 3 years old, a social worker named Catherine Brennan removed you from their custody based on fabricated abuse allegations. The Novaks fought the removal, but by the time courts ruled in their favor, you'd already been placed with the Thompsons through a private adoption that was pushed through with fraudulent documentation. The Novaks never stopped searching for you. They've spent 30 years and their entire savings trying to find their son." Amanda moved closer and put her hand on my arm. "This can't be real. David's parents are upstairs right now. They live in our guest suite. They'd have told us if David was adopted." My parents had moved in 6 months ago after my father's health declined. They were in their late 70s now, and I'd been taking care of them because that's what family did. Except if what this caseworker was saying was true, they'd stolen my entire identity. Leslie pulled a photograph from her folder and held it up. "This is you at age 2 with Richard and Susan Novak." The photo showed a toddler with my exact features sitting between a couple in their late 20s. The man had my nose and jawline. The woman had my eyes and the same widow's peak hairline I'd inherited, or thought I had. The little boy in the photo was wearing overalls and holding a stuffed elephant, laughing at the camera with pure joy. I felt dizzy looking at it because that child was unmistakably me, but I had no memory of these people or that moment. "The Novaks have been working with a private investigator for 15 years, Leslie continued. "They finally tracked you down 3 months ago through DNA database matching. You registered with one of those ancestry websites last year, and your DNA flagged as a familial match to samples the Novaks had submitted to multiple databases. They contacted our department, and we've been investigating the original adoption case. What we found was systematic fraud and corruption. Catherine Brennan, the social worker who removed you from the Novaks, was part of a scheme that stole children from fit parents and placed them with wealthy couples who paid substantial fees for private adoptions. She falsified abuse reports, manipulated evidence, and worked with corrupt officials to push through adoptions that should never have been approved." I heard a sound behind me and turned to see my father, Gerald, standing at the top of the stairs. He must have heard voices and come to investigate. His face had gone completely pale, and he was gripping the railing so hard his knuckles were white. "David," he said, and his voice was shaking. "Don't listen to her. Whatever she's telling you, it's lies. We're your parents. We raised you. We love you." Leslie turned her attention to him. Mr. Thompson, I need to speak with you and your wife about the circumstances of David's adoption. We have evidence that you paid Catherine Brennan $75,000 in 1995 for a private adoption, and that you knew the child you were receiving had been removed from his biological parents under questionable circumstances. There are documents showing you were aware the Novaks were fighting the removal and that you proceeded with the adoption anyway. My father's face crumpled. We were told the child had been abused. We were told we were saving him from a terrible situation. Catherine said the biological parents were drug addicts who'd neglected him. She showed us photos of bruises, medical reports. We thought we were doing the right thing. Leslie's expression hardened. Those photos and reports were fabricated. The Novaks never abused their son. Catherine Brennan created false evidence to justify the removal because you'd paid her to find you, a child. The bruises in those photos? They were from a completely different child in a legitimate abuse case. The medical reports were forged. You paid $75,000 for a stolen child, Mr. Thompson. The room felt like it was tilting. My mother appeared behind my father, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the scene. "Gerald, what's happening?" she asked. Amanda's grip on my arm tightened. "David, sit down. You look like you're going to pass out." But I couldn't sit. I was staring at my parents, these people who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and attended every school event, and trying to reconcile them with the accusation that they'd knowingly adopted a stolen child. "Did you know?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse. "Did you know I was taken from my real parents illegally?" My father came down the stairs slowly, each step seeming to cost him effort. "We didn't know for certain," he said quietly. "Catherine told us. There were complications with the case, that the biological parents were fighting the system, but she assured us everything was legal. She said some parents fight even when they're unfit, that it was normal. We wanted a child so badly. We'd been trying to adopt for years. When Catherine said she had a little boy who needed a home, we didn't ask enough questions. We should have, but we didn't." My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "We loved you from the moment we saw you. Whatever happened before, whatever mistakes were made, we raised you with love. You're our son, David. Nothing can change that." Leslie interrupted firmly. "Mrs. Thompson, I need both you and your husband to come to the county office tomorrow morning at 9 to answer questions about your knowledge of the adoption fraud. We're building a case against Catherine Brennan and several other individuals involved in the adoption scheme, and your cooperation will be necessary. Mr. Thompson," she turned to me, "the Novaks would like to meet you. They've been waiting 3 decades for this moment. I have their contact information here, and they're prepared to provide DNA evidence, childhood photos, and documentation proving you're their biological son. I understand this is traumatic, but they deserve the chance to reunite with the child who was stolen from them." I took the paper she offered. Richard and Susan Novak's names were printed along with a phone number and an address in Portland, Oregon. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "I need time," I said. "I need to process this before I can talk to anyone." Leslie nodded. "That's understandable. But Mr. Thompson, there's something else you should know. You're not the only child Catherine Brennan stole. We've identified at least 8 other cases where she falsified abuse allegations and facilitated fraudulent adoptions. There may be more. Your case is helping us build evidence to bring charges against everyone involved in this scheme. The Novaks filing their complaint and funding the investigation is what broke this open. They never gave up on finding you." After Leslie left, I stood in my living room while my world reconstructed itself around new facts. My parents, Gerald and Diane, sat on the couch looking devastated and old. Amanda had taken our son upstairs, giving us space for a conversation that needed to happen. "Tell me everything," I said. "Tell me exactly what happened 30 years ago." My father rubbed his face with both hands. We'd been on adoption waiting lists for years. Regular channels kept rejecting us because of my age. I was 47 when we started trying. Private adoptions were our only option. Catherine Brennan was recommended to us by another couple who'd adopted through her. She specialized in finding children for families who didn't qualify through traditional agencies. We paid her a consultation fee, and she said she'd look for a match. 6 months later, she called and said she had a little boy. You. She said the biological parents were addicts living in poverty, that you'd been removed for your safety, that they were fighting the system but had no real case. She showed us photos of bruises on a child's body. She showed us reports from doctors saying you were malnourished and developmentally delayed. We believed her. I felt sick. When did you realize the reports might be fake? My mother spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. About 5 years later. You would have been 8. We got a letter forwarded from our old address. It was from a woman named Susan Novak, begging whoever had adopted her son to contact her. She said her child had been stolen, that she was still searching. The letter included a photo of a little boy who looked like you. I wanted to respond, but Gerald said we couldn't. He said if the adoption had problems, we could lose you. So you knew, I said, and my voice was hollow. You knew there was a chance I'd been taken, from my real parents, and you chose to hide it. Gerald stood up and his face was anguished. We chose to protect our family. You were our son by then. You'd been with us for 5 years. You called us mom and dad. You had friends and school and a life. Opening that door would have destroyed everything. We convinced ourselves that Susan Novak was probably lying, that she was one of those parents who loses custody and can't accept it. We told ourselves we'd done the right thing by giving you a stable home. I thought about all the times growing up when I'd asked about baby photos and my parents had shown me pictures that started around age 3. They'd said earlier photos were lost in a move. I thought about how I had no relatives on either side of my family, how my parents claimed to be only children from small families where everyone had died young. I thought about the medical history forms I'd filled out that were always blank because my parents said they didn't know much about genetic conditions in the family. Every lie had been calculated to hide the truth. I need you both to leave, I said. The words came out flat and final. I need you out of my house while I figure out what to do with this information. My mother gasped. David, please, we're still your parents. We raised you. You can't just throw us away because of mistakes we made 30 years ago. You didn't make mistakes, I said, and anger was finally breaking through the shock. You bought a stolen child. You saw evidence that maybe I'd been taken illegally, and you chose to hide it. You let my biological parents spend 3 decades searching for me while you pretended to be the only family I had. That's not a mistake. That's a crime. Gerald's face hardened. We gave you a good life. The Novaks were poor. They could barely afford rent. We gave you private schools, college tuition, opportunities you never would have had with them. Whatever happened at the beginning, we provided for you better than they could have. The statement was so breathtakingly arrogant that I couldn't even respond. Amanda appeared at the top of the stairs. I've called a hotel near the hospital and booked them a room, she said quietly. Their things are packed. David, I think you need to sit down. My parents left an hour later, my mother sobbing and my father silent and stiff with injured pride. After they were gone, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the phone number for Richard and Susan Novak. These people were strangers, but they were also my biological parents. They'd spent my entire life looking for me. I picked up my phone and dialed before I could lose my nerve. A woman answered on the second ring. Hello? Her voice was cautious, hopeful. Is this Susan Novak? I asked, and my own voice sounded strange in my ears. There was a sharp intake of breath. Yes. Who is this? I closed my eyes. My name is David Thompson. Leslie Ortega from Family Services told me you've been looking for me. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. I heard her calling out, Richard, it's him! It's our baby! He called! Then she was back, her words tumbling over themselves. Oh my God, I can't believe this is real. Are you okay? Are you safe? Where have you been all these years? I didn't know how to answer those questions. I'm in Seattle. I've been here my whole life, or at least the part I remember. The people who adopted me, they raised me here. I just found out today that I was adopted, that you existed. The caseworker showed me papers and photos. I don't remember you at all. I'm sorry. Susan was crying openly now. Don't apologize. None of this is your fault. We've been searching for you since you were 3 years old. They took you from us in April 1995, said we'd abused you, which was a complete lie. By the time we proved our innocence and got the court ruling overturned, you were gone. The adoption had already been finalized. We couldn't find out who adopted you because the records were sealed. We've spent 30 years and every penny we had trying to locate you." A man's voice came on the line, shaking with emotion. "This is your father, Richard. I know you don't know us, but I need you to understand something. We never stopped looking. We never stopped loving you. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone, we thought about you. We have a room in our house that's still set up as your nursery because we couldn't let go." I was crying now too, tears running down my face while Amanda stood behind me with her hands on my shoulders. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to process this. The people I thought were my parents have been lying to me my entire life, and now I'm talking to strangers who are telling me they're my real family. I have a son of my own now. I have a life. I don't know how to fit you into it." Richard's voice was gentle. "We're not asking you to change your life. We're just asking for the chance to know you, to explain what happened, to give you the truth about where you came from. We have photos, videos, documents. We can prove everything we're saying. Your name was originally Thomas Richard Novak. You loved that stuffed elephant in the photo you probably saw today. Your favorite food was macaroni and cheese. You used to sing songs from Sesame Street. You were the happiest little boy, and then one day, a social worker came to our door and took you away based on lies." The grief in his voice was raw and real. These people had lost a child and spent 3 decades trying to get him back. Meanwhile, I'd been living an hour's flight away, completely unaware that my entire identity was built on fraud. "Can we meet?" I asked. "I need to see you in person, to understand what happened. I need to know the whole truth, not just pieces." Susan's voice came back on. "We can be there tomorrow. We can leave right now if you want. We've been waiting 30 years. We'll come whenever you're ready." We arranged to meet the next afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. After I hung up, I sat in silence, trying to absorb everything. Amanda sat down next to me. "Are you okay?" she asked. I shook my head. I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my past is a lie. The next day, I walked into the coffee shop at exactly 2 in the afternoon. I'd barely slept, my mind spinning through decades of memories and trying to identify which parts were real and which were elaborate deception. Amanda was with me, holding my hand, providing support I desperately needed. Sitting at a corner table were a couple in their 50s who stood up when they saw me. The woman had my eyes, and she was pressing her hand over her mouth like she was trying not to break down. The man had my build and facial structure. Looking at them was like seeing a genetic blueprint I'd never known existed. They approached slowly, carefully, like I was, a wild animal that might bolt. "Thomas?" Susan said, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, David. I know that's your name now. For so many years I've pictured calling you Thomas again." I extended my hand, unsure of the appropriate greeting, but Susan pulled me into a fierce hug. She was shaking and crying, and I stood there awkwardly, not knowing how to respond to this stranger who was technically my mother. Richard waited until she stepped back, then pulled me into an equally emotional embrace. "I can't believe you're real," he said. "I can't believe we finally found you." We sat down at the table, and for several minutes no one spoke. They just stared at me, memorizing my face, and I stared back, trying to see myself in their features. "Tell me what happened," I finally said. "Tell me everything." Richard took a shaky breath and began. "We were young when you were born. I was 24, Susan was 23. We were struggling financially because I was in school studying engineering, and Susan was working as a waitress. We lived in a small apartment in Portland, but you were healthy and happy, and we loved you more than anything. In April 1995, when you were 3, someone called Child Protective Services and reported that they'd seen bruises on you at a playground. A social worker named Catherine Brennan came to investigate. She was immediately hostile, treating us like criminals before she'd even examined you. She took photos of you and said she found evidence of abuse. We were horrified because we'd never hurt you. The bruises she documented were from normal childhood activities. You'd fallen off a slide a few days earlier and had a scrape on your knee. You'd bumped into a table and had a small bruise on your arm. Normal things that happen to active toddlers. Susan picked up the story. Catherine said she was removing you temporarily while they investigated. She said it was standard procedure, that we'd get you back once they confirmed there was no abuse. We were terrified, but we cooperated because we thought the truth would come out. They placed you in foster care, and we started the process of fighting to get you back. But Catherine was building a false case against us. She claimed we were drug users, which was completely fabricated. She had us drug tested, and the tests came back clean, but then she claimed the tests were faulty. She said we were mentally unstable. She brought in a psychologist who evaluated us and found nothing wrong, but she dismissed that evaluation. We hired a lawyer, Richard continued, but the system was stacked against us. Family court operates on the principle of protecting the child first, which means once you were removed, we had to prove we weren't abusive rather than the state proving we were. It's backwards, and Catherine exploited that. She kept extending the investigation, finding new reasons to keep you in foster care. Meanwhile, we were drowning in legal fees, and I'd had to drop out of school to work full-time. 6 months after you were taken, Catherine informed us that you'd been placed for adoption. She said parental rights had been terminated based on her findings of chronic abuse and neglect. We appealed immediately, but the adoption was pushed through a private agency with incredible speed. By the time we got a court date to contest the termination of our rights, you were already gone. Tears were streaming down Susan's face. The appeals court eventually ruled in our favor. They found that Catherine Brennan had falsified evidence and that the removal was unjustified. But you were already adopted, and the court said they couldn't reverse an adoption that had been finalized in good faith by the adoptive parents. The judge apologized to us. He said it was a miscarriage of justice, but that his hands were tied because disrupting your placement at that point would be traumatic for you. We were supposed to just accept that our child had been stolen and move on. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. How is that legal? How can a court say the adoption was wrong but not give you back your child? Richard's expression was bitter. Because family law prioritizes stability over justice. Once you'd been with the Thompsons for over a year, the court considered you bonded to them and ruled that removing you would cause you psychological harm. Our rights as your biological parents were considered less important than maintaining your attachment to your adoptive parents. It's a legal principle designed to protect children from being bounced between homes, but in cases like ours, it means stolen children stay stolen. Susan opened a large folder she'd brought and spread photos across the table. This is you at 6 months old. This is your first birthday. This is you at the zoo when you were 2. This is the last photo we have of you before Catherine took you. I looked at the images of a happy toddler with parents who clearly adored him. In every YAD photo, I was smiling, healthy, loved. There was no evidence of abuse or neglect, just a normal family. We never stopped looking, Susan said. We hired private investigators. We contacted every adoption agency in the Pacific Northwest. We registered with missing children databases. We submitted DNA to every genetic testing service that would take it. We spent every dollar we had and went into debt trying to find you. Friends and family told us to move on, to have another child. But we couldn't. You were our son. You were out there somewhere, and we needed to find you. Amanda, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up. Why did the social worker target you? If there was no abuse, why did she choose you to steal David from? Richard's jaw tightened. Catherine Brennan was running an adoption scheme. She identified vulnerable parents who couldn't afford good lawyers and fabricated abuse cases to remove their children. Then she placed those children with wealthy couples who paid her substantial fees for private adoptions. We were perfect targets because we were young, poor, and had no family support. My parents had died before you were born, and Susan's family had cut her off when she got pregnant before marriage. We had no one to advocate for us. Catherine knew she could destroy us, and no one would intervene. I felt rage building in my chest. And the Thompsons knew. They knew something was wrong with the adoption, and they went through with it anyway. Susan looked at me with profound sadness. We sent letters trying to reach you for years after the adoption. We didn't know who had adopted you, but we sent letters to every adoption attorney and agency in Washington, begging them to forward our information to whoever had our son. We never got a response. If the Thompsons received our letters and chose not to respond, if they knew you'd been stolen and kept you anyway, then yes, they were complicit. I thought about the letter my mother had mentioned, the one they'd received when I was 8 and chosen to hide. They'd known, and they'd decided their desire to keep me was more important than reuniting me with my real parents. "What happens now?" I asked. "Leslie Ortega said there's an investigation. What does that mean legally?" Richard leaned forward. "Catherine Brennan is being charged with fraud, falsifying official documents, and corruption. The adoption agency she worked with is under investigation. Several other social workers and officials who facilitated her scheme are facing charges. The Thompsons might be charged as well, depending on what investigators determine they knew and when they knew it. There are at least 8 other families like us who've been identified as victims and possibly more. This is going to be a major case." Susan reached across the table and took my hand. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you have a life and a family of your own. We're not trying to disrupt that or take you away from the people you love. But David, we're your parents. We never chose to give you up. You were stolen from us. We just want the chance to know you, to be part of your life if you'll let us. We've missed 30 years. We don't want to miss any more." I looked at their faces, at the desperate hope and love there, and felt torn between conflicting emotions. These people were my biological parents. They'd done nothing wrong except be poor and vulnerable. They'd fought for me and lost, through no fault of their own. But Gerald and Diane had raised me. They'd been at my soccer games and school plays. They'd taught me to drive and helped me move into college dorms. Could I just erase that because the foundation was built on lies? Over the next weeks, I met with Richard and Susan regularly. They shared stories about my early childhood, showed me videos of my first steps and first words. I learned that my great-grandmother had been a concert pianist, and that musical talent ran in the family. I learned that I had cousins I'd never met, that Susan had eventually reconciled with her parents, and they'd helped fund the search for me. I learned that Richard had become a successful engineer despite having to delay his education, and that they'd never had other children because they couldn't bear to replace me. I also learned the full extent of Catherine Brennan's crimes. The investigation Leslie Ortega was conducting had uncovered a scheme that had been operating for over 15 years. Catherine had worked with corrupt officials in multiple states, identifying vulnerable families and removing their children on fabricated grounds. She'd placed at least 12 children with wealthy adoptive parents who'd paid fees ranging from $50,000 to over $100,000. Some of those adoptive parents claimed they'd been deceived about the circumstances, while others had clear evidence they'd known the children were being stolen. Gerald and Diane fell into the latter category. Investigators found emails between them and Catherine where they'd discussed concerns about the Novaks fighting the adoption. Catherine had assured them everything would be handled, that the biological parents would be legally prevented from interfering. The Thompsons had expressed worry but ultimately decided to proceed. That evidence proved they'd known the adoption was suspicious and had chosen to go forward anyway. Amanda and I discussed the situation endlessly. She was supportive, but also practical. "David, you need to decide what kind of relationship you want with all these people. You can't spend your whole life torn between 2 families. You need to make choices and move forward." She was right, but making those choices felt impossible. My parents, the ones who'd raised me, had lied and stolen. But they'd also loved me. My biological parents had been victims, but they were strangers. How did I balance those realities? The decision was partially made for me when Gerald and Diane were formally charged as accessories to child trafficking. The district attorney determined that their knowledge of the suspicious circumstances and their decision to proceed with the adoption made them criminally liable. They faced potential prison time and were required to pay restitution to the Novaks for the emotional harm and financial losses incurred in searching for me. Gerald called me after being charged, his voice hollow. "David, I need you to testify on our behalf. Tell the court that we were good parents, that we gave you a good life. Your testimony could make the difference between prison and probation." I sat in my living room holding the phone and thought about everything I'd learned. "You stole me," I said quietly. "You knew I'd been taken from my real parents and you kept me anyway. You saw the letter from Susan begging for information and you hid it. You chose to prioritize your desire for a child over my right to know my real family. I can't testify that what you did was acceptable because it wasn't." Gerald's voice turned harsh. "After everything we did for you, this is how you repay us. We raised you. We paid for your education. We gave you opportunities, and now you're going to abandon us for people you don't even know? I felt something break inside me. You bought me. You paid $75,000 for a stolen child, and you've spent 30 years pretending it was legitimate. I don't owe you gratitude for raising me when you only had me because you committed a crime. Whatever love you feel for me doesn't erase what you did. I hung up and blocked their numbers. Amanda held me while I cried, mourning the loss of the parents I'd thought I had and trying to accept the complicated reality of the ones I'd gained. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Catherine Brennan was the primary defendant, but Gerald and Diane Thompson were tried alongside several other adoptive parents and officials who'd participated in the scheme. I testified about my experience discovering the adoption fraud, about the letter my parents had hidden, about their admission that they'd known the adoption was suspicious. Richard and Susan testified about losing me, about the 3 decades of searching, about the financial and emotional devastation. Other biological parents testified about similar experiences. The most heartbreaking testimony came from a woman whose daughter had been stolen at age 4 and adopted by a family in California. She'd spent 18 years searching before the investigation connected her case to Catherine's scheme. Her daughter was now 22 and wanted nothing to do with her biological mother, having been told her entire life that she'd been rescued from an abusive situation. The evidence against Catherine Brennan was overwhelming. Forensic accountants had traced payments from adoptive parents to offshore accounts Catherine controlled. Document experts had proven that abuse reports and medical records had been falsified. Former colleagues testified that Catherine had bragged about her ability to push through difficult adoptions. The jury convicted her on all counts. She was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for child trafficking, fraud, and corruption. Her co-conspirators, including several social workers and 2 judges who'd facilitated the fraudulent adoptions, received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Gerald and Diane Thompson were convicted as accessories to child trafficking. The judge, a stern man in his 60s, delivered a harsh sentence. You knew this child had been taken from his biological parents under questionable circumstances, and you chose to proceed with the adoption anyway. You prioritized your desire for a child over that child's right to his own family. Your actions enabled a criminal scheme and caused immeasurable harm to innocent people. I'm sentencing you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation. My mother sobbed in the courtroom. My father sat stone-faced. I watched from the gallery, feeling numb. These people had raised me, and now they were going to prison because of choices they'd made before I was old enough to remember. Part of me felt guilty, like I should have testified on their behalf, like my lack of support had sealed their fate. But the larger part of me knew they'd earned their punishment. The Novaks were awarded $2 million in restitution from the proceeds of Catherine Brennan's seized assets and from the Thompsons' estate. They didn't want the money, they wanted their son back, but the court determined that financial compensation was necessary to acknowledge the harm done. Richard and Susan used most of the money to establish a foundation supporting families dealing with wrongful child removals, turning their tragedy into advocacy for others facing similar situations. Meanwhile, I tried to build a relationship with my biological parents while processing the grief of losing the people who'd raised me. It was complicated and messy. There were days I resented Richard and Susan for disrupting my life, even though I knew logically that none of this was their fault. There were days I missed Gerald and Diane, despite knowing they'd stolen me. Therapy helped, both individual sessions and family counseling with the Novaks. Slowly, over months and then years, I began to accept my history. I was Thomas Richard Novak, who'd been renamed David Thompson. I was the child of 4 parents, 2 who'd lost me through crime, and 2 who'd gained me through crime. I was a victim of a system that had failed to protect me and a survivor of circumstances beyond my control. My son grew up knowing both sets of grandparents through stories. He knew that Grandma Susan and Grandpa Richard were his real grandmother and grandfather, and that the other grandparents had made mistakes that sent them to prison. We explained it in age-appropriate ways as he got older, teaching him about justice and consequences and the complexity of human morality. 5 years after the trial, I attended Gerald Thompson's parole hearing. He'd served his sentence and was requesting early release for good behavior. Diane had already been released. her health having deteriorated in prison. She'd moved to Arizona to live with her sister and hadn't contacted me. Gerald looked old and broken standing before the parole board. He'd aged 20 years in 5. When asked if he had anything to say, he looked directly at me. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked. "I'm sorry for what I did to you and to your real parents. I was selfish and arrogant. I convinced myself that providing you with material comfort justified how I obtained you. I was wrong. I stole your childhood from people who loved you, and I stole your truth from you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I recognize what I did was unforgivable." I stood up when the board asked if I wanted to make a statement. Gerald Thompson raised me with what I believe was genuine love, but that love was built on a crime. He had opportunities to do the right thing, to respond to letters from my biological parents, to come forward about the suspicious adoption, but he chose his own interests over mine and over the Novaks. He deserves the consequences he's facing, but I also acknowledge that he provided for me and cared for me in his own flawed way. I'm not asking for leniency, and I'm not asking for a harsher sentence. I'm asking the board to make whatever decision reflects appropriate justice. The board granted Gerald parole with strict conditions. He was released 3 months later. He called once, asking if we could meet. I declined. Maybe someday I'd be ready for that conversation, but not yet. I'm 38 now, 5 years past the day Leslie Ortega showed up at my door and dismantled my identity. My son is 7 and my daughter is 3. Richard and Susan are active grandparents who visit regularly and video chat with the kids every week. We've built a relationship that feels genuine, though sometimes I still catch them looking at me with grief for the years they lost. I work as an advocate for foster care reform, using my story to push for better oversight and protections against wrongful removals. I testify before legislators and speak at conferences about the need for accountability in child welfare systems. Catherine Brennan's scheme destroyed dozens of families, but it also revealed systematic vulnerabilities that allowed such schemes to exist. My work focuses on closing those gaps. Sometimes I think about alternate timelines. What if Catherine had never targeted the Novaks? What if I'd grown up as Thomas, in Portland, with my biological parents? Would I be happier? Would I be the same person? There's no way to know, and I've stopped torturing myself with those questions. I am who I am because of everything that happened, both the crime that stole me and the 3 decades I spent living under a false identity. Last month, Susan showed me a box she'd kept for 30 years, filled with birthday cards she'd written but never sent, Christmas presents she'd bought but never given. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again," she said, tears in her eyes. "But I couldn't stop celebrating your life, even when you weren't there to celebrate with me." I held my mother while she cried, and for the first time, the word mother felt right when I thought about her. Not replacing the woman who'd raised me, but reclaiming the relationship that had been stolen. This is my life now, built from wreckage, reconstructed from truth, moving forward with the family I was born to and the scars from the family that stole me, finding justice not in revenge but in advocacy, and teaching my children that love without honesty is just another form of theft. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.